They say the most dangerous man in the city can break bones with a glance, move $1 million with a phone call, and make a sitting judge sweat through his robes with nothing but silence. What they never tell you is that for 3 weeks, the most feared man in all of Palermo Heights could not get his 9-month-old son to stop screaming. Not the nannies, not the pediatricians flown in from Geneva, not the rotating staff of 12 who walked those marble halls like they were tiptoeing through a minefield. Nobody could reach the baby who had buried 2 mothers. The biological one who died in childbirth, and every surrogate caretaker who followed, all driven out by a grief so loud it had turned into rage before the boy even learned to sit up. Dante Cavalcante had ordered men buried in cement and never lost a night of sleep. But he stood outside the nursery door at 2 a.m, jaw tight, hands fisted at his sides, completely helpless, and then a woman who wasn't supposed to be there. A temporary kitchen maid hired to cover a sick colleague, a woman who cost $40 an hour and owned exactly 1 pair of dress shoes, walked down that hall carrying a basket of warm linens, heard the sound coming from behind that door, and did what no trained professional had managed to do. She went in. That is where our story begins. Not with power, not with violence, with a woman named Rosalind Mejia, who did not know that the moment she crossed that threshold, she was stepping into the most important room of her life. The world has a habit of deciding who matters and who does not, based on the narrowest possible evidence. The cut of a jacket, the number on a scale, the zip code on a lease. Rosalind had spent her entire 29 years being sorted into the second category by people who had barely looked up. She had learned to move quietly because quiet people are forgiven for taking up space. She had learned to make herself useful because useful people are tolerated. She had not learned yet that usefulness and quiet are not the same as smallness, and that the right person, watching her in the right moment, would understand the difference long before she did. Rosalind was 29 years old, 5'4", and built the way her mother always called generously, which was a kind word for a world that had not always been kind. She had hips that filled doorways and a softness to her that people mistook for weakness so regularly that she had stopped being surprised by it. She was a temp worker for the Cavalcante estate through a placement agency that had very clearly told her, do not engage with the family directly, do not enter any rooms above the ground floor, and under no circumstances approach the child. The child, 9-month-old Matteo Cavalcante, had, according to the intake paperwork she had been handed in a sealed envelope, screamed continuously for 6 hours at their last nanny before the woman walked out without collecting her final paycheck. The paperwork listed her as a kitchen aide. Her job was flour, dish soap, and the service elevator. That was all. She had been on the estate for exactly 4 hours when she heard it. A sound that traveled through the ceiling above the kitchen, through solid limestone and vintage oak paneling, and still landed in her chest like a fist. She had grown up the oldest of 5. She had held crying babies in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Vega district while her mother worked double shifts, and she knew the difference between angry crying and the other kind. That sound coming from upstairs was the other kind. It was not fury. It was loneliness, shaped like fury. It was a baby boy who had decided that the entire world had already abandoned him, and he was simply letting the world know he'd received the message. Rosalind set down her basket. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the service staircase at the end of the hall. She thought about the sealed envelope and the intake paperwork, and the $40 an hour, which was more than she had made at any single job in the last 3 years. And she thought about the loan shark named Piero Sansa, who had her mother's name on a debt that was growing at 11% per month, and she picked up her basket again. She climbed the stairs anyway. She would think about that decision later, in the weeks that followed, in the odd quiet hours when Matteo was sleeping and the estate settled into its nighttime register of distant traffic and the hum of the security system. And she would never be able to explain it cleanly. It was not bravery, Bravery implies a considered choice, a moment where the cost is weighed and accepted. This was something more instinctive than that, something that bypassed calculation entirely and came from the same place that made her the older sister who always got up first, who always checked on the others, who could not hear something suffering without moving toward it. She climbed the stairs because the alternative, standing in that hallway listening, was not something her body was willing to do. The nursery was at the end of the east wing, behind a door that probably cost more than her car. She did not knock. Knocking would have been useless. She simply opened the door, walked in, set her basket of linens on the changing table, and looked at Matteo Cavalcante for the first time. He was enormous for 9 months, dense and furious and red-faced, arms windmilling in his crib with the commitment of someone who had decided this was a full-time occupation. The room smelled of expensive baby products and something else underneath, the particular staleness of a space that had not had enough human warmth in it. She did not rush. She did not make large, sudden movements. She sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, and she started to hum. Not a lullaby, not something deliberate, just a low, rambling, tuneless sound, the way she used to do with her youngest sister Carmen, who had been born colicky and furious and had spent her first year of life in Rosalind's arms while their mother slept between shifts. The humming was not music. It was more like weather. It was warmth given a frequency. It took 4 minutes, 4 minutes of her sitting in that chair, one hand resting on the crib rail within reach but not grasping, humming that low, tuneless sound, before Matteo Cavalcante ran out of reasons to scream. His arms slowed. His breath caught and hitched in that jagged way that follows a very long storm. His eyes found her face. She looked back at him without alarm, without desperation, without the carefully arranged professional calm that babies always see through. She looked at him the way she looked at all small children, with a kind of patient acknowledgement, as if to say, "I know. It is hard. I see you." He reached up with one fat fist and grabbed the air in her direction. She reached in and picked him up. He curled into the softness of her and went still. She stood there for a moment, just breathing, feeling the dense animal warmth of him, the way his hands had already found the fabric of her collar and gripped it with the specific grip of a baby who has decided you are staying. Her back ached slightly from the awkward angle of leaning over the crib rail. Her heart was doing something irregular. The room was very quiet, in the way that rooms become quiet after a long storm has passed. The silence not an absence, but a presence, almost textural, something you could lean into. She sat back down in the rocking chair and held him and rocked and did not think about anything at all for a while. It was the most peaceful she had felt in months. She did not know that Dante Cavalcante had come home early. She did not know that his head of security, a former intelligence operative named Corso, had told him in a flat voice that there was an unauthorized individual in the nursery. She did not know that Dante had climbed those stairs in a silence that his men described afterward as worse than shouting, and she did not know that he had stood in the doorway of that nursery for 3 full minutes watching her before she became aware of him. What she knew was the weight of the baby in her arms and the way the room had settled into something that felt almost like peace. When she finally turned and saw the man in the doorway, she nearly lost her footing. She had seen photographs in the agency briefing file. The square-cut jaw, the dark eyes that seemed to pull light inward rather than reflect it, the particular stillness of a man who has learned that movement is a form of information he prefers not to give away. But the photographs had not prepared her for the scale of him, the way he took up the doorway, not just physically, but atmospherically, the way the very air in the room seemed to reorganize itself around his presence. He was in a charcoal suit that had not come off a rack in this century, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was about to be fired, that she was about to be escorted out, blacklisted from the agency, and handed back to Piero Sanza and his 11% per month with nothing to show for it. Instead, Dante Cavalcante said nothing. He looked at his son, at Matteo, who was asleep against her shoulder. The boy's dense weight completely surrendered, his breath slow and even, in a way that Dante had not seen in weeks. He looked at her. His jaw moved once, the way a man's jaw moves when he is calculating something important and wants no one to see the calculation. Then he stepped back from the doorway and through Corso sent word to the agency that Rosalind Mejia's contract was to be converted immediately to full-time live-in at a rate the agency had to repeat twice because the placement coordinator thought she had misheard. That was how it began. Not with an interview, not with a formal offer, with a silent man standing in a doorway, watching his son sleep for the first time in 3 weeks and making a decision the way he made all decisions, without explanation, without ceremony, and without any apparent awareness that the woman at the center of it might need to be consulted. She had been told the following morning by a woman she had never seen before who appeared at her apartment door at 7 a.m., with paperwork already drawn up and a pen already uncapped. She had signed it standing in her doorway in her robe, still holding her coffee, reading the salary line 3 times because the number did not seem like a real number for a real job in the real world. The woman with the paperwork said only, "Be at the estate by noon." Rosalind looked at the number again. She said, "I'll be there by 10. Rosalind learned this about him quickly. Dante Cavalcante did not ask. He arranged. He determined what needed to happen and then caused it to happen. And the gap between decision and execution was so small, it was almost imperceptible. The household that she moved into, her small bag packed in 2 hours, her mother called with careful vagueness, the studio apartment in Vegas sublet to a cousin, was the size of a small hotel and operated with the precision of a military installation. There were 12 full-time staff. There was a head chef named Berto, who ran the kitchen with the controlled intensity of a man who had once been responsible for a Michelin star and had opinions about everything. There was a head of household named Signora Mara, a woman in her 60s who wore black exclusively and had the energy of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that she worked for a man who could have people disappeared and had chosen to be at peace with it. There was Corso, who was everywhere and nowhere, who appeared at Dante's shoulder with information and vanished again, without Rosalind ever quite seeing him leave a room. And there was the East Wing, which was Matteo's wing, which was now also hers. She was given a room adjacent to the nursery, not a staff room, which she had expected, but something with actual furniture and actual curtains, and a window that looked over the formal garden, which she had not expected at all. Signora Mara showed it to her with a neutral expression and said, "The boy needs consistency. You are to be consistent." Rosalind unpacked her bag and hung her 4 blouses in a closet built for 20 and sat on the edge of a bed that was better than any bed she had ever slept in, and felt the disorientation of someone who had walked through a door they didn't know was there. She did not see Dante for 4 days after the nursery. He moved through the estate on a schedule that existed parallel to hers. She knew he was there from the shift in the household's energy, the way everyone straightened imperceptibly when certain doors were opened, the way conversations changed register without anyone saying a word. She heard his voice once through a wall, low and deliberate, speaking to Corso, and the quality of his voice at rest, not angry, simply authoritative in the way that a structural beam is authoritative, made her stop what she was doing and wait until it passed. She focused on Matteo. That was her job, and she was good at it in a way that surprised even herself. She had a gift she had never named because it had never needed a name, a specific frequency of attention that she gave to small children, a quality of presence that was neither anxious nor performed. With Matteo, she was simply there, fully, unhurriedly, in the way that she had never quite been able to be in any other part of her life. He thrived, Within 6 days, he had begun to smile. Within 10, he was laughing. A sound, according to Berto, who had been on the estate for 4 years, that had never been heard before. She began baking in the evenings when the kitchen was quiet, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the smell of something warm seemed to fill the east wing and change its quality, the way a single lit candle changes a room that is not quite dark. She made pan de bono because it was what her grandmother made, and because the smell of it was the smell of something good coming. She made it at 7 in the evening, and by 8 the kitchen had acquired occupants, Berto, who appeared under the pretext of checking the ovens, 2 of the house staff who materialized near the island with unconvincing reasons, and, on the 11th evening, Dante Cavalcante, who came through the kitchen door at 7:53 in his shirt sleeves with his tie loosened and stood at the far end of the kitchen island and did not explain his presence there at all. She had been elbow deep in dough. She did not bolt upright. She did not apologize. She looked at him and said, in a voice she kept carefully even, "There's enough if you want some." He stayed for 40 minutes. He did not speak often, but he ate 3 pieces of pan de bono standing at her kitchen island and watched her work with those dark eyes that missed nothing. And when he left, he said only, "You smell like vanilla," in a tone so flat and uninflected that it took her until she was back in her room, lying awake, to understand that it had not been an observation. It had been the beginning of something. The threat arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a man she had hoped she would never see again. She had known, in the abstract, that Piero Sansa would find her eventually. Men like Piero Sansa always found the people they considered their property, regardless of where those people went, because tracking them down was not incidental to their business. It was the business. Her mother had borrowed $11,000 3 years ago, when the hospital bills from a gallbladder surgery had arrived in quantities that bore no relationship to anything Rosalind had imagined a gallbladder could cost. And what had been 11,000 had become, through the particular mathematics of Sansa's interest rates, something considerably larger. Rosalind had been making payments. She had been making them faithfully every month, watching the principal barely move, understanding with the slow-building clarity of someone watching a tide come in, that she was not paying down a debt so much as servicing a captivity. She was in the garden with Matteo when she heard her name, not from inside the estate, but from the service gate at the far end of the property, called in a voice she recognized with the cold certainty of a physical reflex. Piero Sansa was not a large man. He was meticulous and soft-spoken, and wore his wealth in the particular way of men who had acquired it through other people's desperation, which is to say carefully and without ostentation. He was standing at the gate with 2 men she did not know, and he was smiling the way he always smiled, which was with all his teeth and none of his eyes. He said her name again. He said that her mother's debt had been transferred to a new account, and that new accounts came with new terms, and that he had come personally because he was considerate like that, and that the terms included her coming to work for him directly, beginning on Saturday, in a capacity that he described in terms that made the garden go cold around her. She stood very still. She held Matteo against her chest. She said, "I'm employed here." He said that was fine, that she could be employed in 2 places, that it would be a shame if something happened to her mother's apartment because of a paperwork error with the utilities, and that she should think about it, and that he would be back on Saturday, and that he was looking forward to it. Then he left. She stood in the garden for a long time after he was gone, until Matteo started to fuss against the cold, and then she went inside and found Signora Mara and said she needed to speak with someone about a personal matter. And Signora Mara looked at her face and went to find Corso. She did not know that the garden had cameras. She did not know that Corso had already flagged the service gate incident before she had reached the kitchen. She did not know that by the time she was explaining the situation in a small voice to a stone-faced Corso, Dante Cavalcante was already watching the footage in his office with a stillness around him that his men knew, that stillness that came before something final happened. She did not know any of that. She knew only that she was trying very hard not to cry in front of a man she barely knew, explaining a debt that had grown from her mother's medical bills into something that had its own teeth, and that her hands were shaking slightly, and that Matteo had fallen asleep on her shoulder again, his weight warm and trusting and completely unaware of what was being decided around him. Corso listened to all of it without a single change of expression. Then he said, "I'll pass this on." That was Friday morning. Piero Sansa did not make it to Saturday. On Friday evening he received a visit at his home office from Dante Cavalcante and 4 men, and whatever was discussed in that office lasted less than 20 minutes, and when Dante left, Piero Sansa had transferred the entirety of Rosalind's mother's debt to an account that Dante then zeroed with a single instruction, and Piero Sansa had also agreed, with the specific sincerity of a man who understood the exact nature of what he was agreeing to never approach Rosalind Mejia or any member of her family again, for any reason, for any amount of money, for the rest of his living years. Rosalind learned all of this on Saturday morning when Corso appeared at the nursery door and told her, in the same flat voice he used for everything, that her mother's financial situation had been resolved and that the individual who had presented himself at the service gate would not be returning. She stared at him. She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means it's resolved." She thought about asking more questions and then looked at his face and understood that the answers to more questions would not make her feel better, and that it was resolved, and that her mother was safe, and that Matteo was awake in the crib behind her reaching for her hair. She said, "Thank you." Corso said, "Thank Mr. Cavalcante," and left. She stood in the nursery doorway for a long time. Then she went and picked up the baby. That evening Dante appeared in the kitchen again at 7:53, as if the previous 2 weeks had been establishing a schedule. She had made pandabono again, and something else, a dish her grandmother made for important occasions, because her hands had needed something to do that required all of her attention. He came and stood at the island and looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, in the quiet, certain way he said everything, "Your mother is safe. You're safe. This is not a negotiation. It is simply true," she said. "That's not how the world works," he said. "It is how my world works," he said. "I protect what is mine." The kitchen was very quiet. Matteo was asleep upstairs. The pandabono was warm on the rack, and the kitchen smelled of it. That smell that was the smell of something good coming. And she thought, for the first time in longer than she could name, that she believed him. Not the words. She had heard words from men before. She believed the fact of it, the thing that had already been done, the mother who was already safe. The man standing across the island from her with his tie loosened and his dark eyes holding nothing but certainty. She set down the spatula. She crossed the kitchen. He did not move. He simply received her, the way a wall receives someone who leans against it, fully and without question, his arms coming around her with a care that did not match anything she had been led to expect from a man like him. And she pressed her face against his shirt and let go of something she had been carrying since before she could remember. He held her. He said nothing. He smelled of cedar and cold air, and something underneath that she would only later recognize as relief. His own, the same quality of release, as if she had given him something back by simply staying. He said quietly, against her hair, "Mia cara." It was not a declaration. It did not need to be. Outside, the garden was dark and the city was doing its usual violent dreaming. And inside the kitchen smelled of vanilla and warm bread. And Dante Cavalcante, the most feared man in Palermo Heights, stood in his kitchen with his arms around a woman who had walked into his house carrying a basket of linens and given his son back his voice, and understood that whatever he had thought his life was going to be, it had just become something else entirely. The cold mansion had a heartbeat now. He had noticed it the moment she arrived, and he had been too careful to name it, and it did not matter because it was already true. She wore his ring 6 months later, in the garden where she had stood terrified, holding Matteo, while a man threatened her at the gate. The ring was not what she would have chosen for herself, which was to say it was not modest. It was the kind of ring that made a statement in the way Dante made all statements. Without raising his voice, without seeking approval, with the quiet assurance of a man who has decided something is true and finds the rest of the world's opinion on the matter genuinely beside the point. She had looked at it when he put it on her finger and laughed. Actually laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised her on the way out. And he had looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize over 6 months, the one that was not quite a smile, but contained everything a smile contains. The expression he kept for her, and for Matteo, and for nobody else in his city. She had stopped being ashamed of her hands by then. She had stopped being ashamed of most things. He had a way of looking at her that made shame feel like a language she no longer spoke. The garden had been replanted by then. She had opinions about gardens, and Dante had, characteristically, caused those opinions to become reality without discussion. Matteo pulled at her dress during the small ceremony and laughed his enormous laugh, which still made Berto stop whatever he was doing and tilt his head as if making sure he was hearing it right. Signora Mara wore something other than black for the first time in 4 years, which everyone agreed was the most remarkable event of the evening. Corso stood at the perimeter and watched the gate, and Rosalind Mejia, who had arrived at a locked door carrying $40 worth of work and a lifetime of being told she was too much, too soft, too loud in the body, not enough in every other way, stood in a garden that now smelled like something she had planted herself, wearing a ring on her finger and holding the child who had chosen her before anyone else had thought to, and understood at last what her grandmother had always meant when she said that the right room recognizes you the moment you walk in. She had walked into the right room. She had not known it was hers. She knew it now. The woman who had been invisible had become the center of the most feared man's world, and she had done it not with weapons or leverage or cunning strategy, but with the oldest power there is, the willingness to walk into a room where something was suffering and stay until it was not. She had walked in carrying $40 worth of work and a basket of warm linens and the long-practiced art of making herself small, and she had been seen anyway. Seen first by a baby who did not yet have language for what he needed and found it in her regardless, and then by a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people performing for his attention and recognized, in her complete absence of performance, something he had not known he was looking for. The underworld had a queen now. She had not campaigned for the position. She had simply shown up and stayed and been exactly and entirely herself, which turned out to be the most dangerous and most irreplaceable thing in the room. Oh, this story absolutely consumed me from the very first line, and I have a feeling you felt the same way. The moment little Matteo went quiet in Rosalind's arms and Dante appeared in the doorway, I had chills. Pure, earned, beautiful chills. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me, please give it a like because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love exactly this kind of storytelling. Share it with someone who needs a story about quiet strength winning over loud power. I promise you know at least one person who would be wrecked by this in the best way. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story because we are just getting started and the stories coming next are even more intense. And I need to know, what was the moment that got you? Was it Matteo going silent in her arms? Was it Dante at the kitchen island at 7:53 like clockwork? Was it the 3 words, mia cara, in the kitchen? Tell me in the comments because I read every single one. And talking about these stories with you is genuinely my favorite part of all of it.